back at the regular time, 11:30 to 1 in Wexner 434 AB, and then on the 23rd of April we have Brendan Nyan, also 11:30 to 1 in Wexner 434 AB. So please come to those if you can. Today we have Professor Deb Roy, an associate professor of media arts and sciences at MIT. Where he directs the laboratory for social machines based at the Media Lab. His lab researches media analytics and design with applications in children's learning and social listening. He's also co-founder and chairman of Cortico, a social venture developing media technologies and services to foster a healthy public sphere. He was co-founder and CEO of Bluefin Labs, a media analytics company that was acquired by Twitter in 2013. Subsequently, he served as Twitter's chief media scientist, where he guided that company's data science strategy. He's author of over 130 papers, academic papers, as well as a TED Talk on the birth of a word, in which he presents research on his son's language development that led to new ideas in media analytics. And I think I'm going to stop there and just turn the stage over to Professor Deb Roy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Note to self, shorten bio. Really a delight to be here. My apologies. I discovered there are 2 Lit Tower buildings on Harvard campus. And that discovery cost all of you 10 minutes, so my apologies. What I want to do today is highlight a little bit of past work, and then actually spend, and should we end at 2:30? Is that the that's the goal?
We have till 3, so we'll leave some time. Leave that.
Okay, great. So what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about past work, but actually focus more on what is cooking today in our lab and where it's going, because I find that's the work I'm most excited about, and also I'd love to have some time for feedback and on half-baked ideas, which is how we shape where we go. I'm going to tell you about work that was done by mostly people in this picture. This is from our group offsite from last fall. And there's actually 2 groups, Laboratory for Social Machines and Cortico. And I just want to explain up front, because it's a little bit of an unusual structure, what those 2 groups are. And then I'm going to completely blend work from both of these groups in terms of everything I talked to you about or share with you. So the Lab for Social Machines is part of the Media Lab, which is part of MIT, so it is completely a kind of typical Media Lab style group. We have 17 graduate students, mainly in the PhD track, and then a variety of research staff and external members who spend time with our group. And most of the graduate students are doing work in areas like machine learning, natural language processing, network science. There's also some people with backgrounds in product design, data visualization. So that's sort of the mix on the graduate side. And then we have folks with backgrounds in journalism, news, constitutional law, children's education, that make up some of the non-graduate student staff. So that is Lab for Social Machines. Cortico was formed 2 years ago. It's a 501c3 nonprofit, but it's also a technology company. There's a core group right now, about a half dozen, so it's not as large as the lab side, but it's growing pretty quickly. And there are ex-Twitter, ex-Google, engineering, product-oriented folks in that small but growing team. And as I've tried to depict here, the sort of role of the lab is to do research, and I'll show you a couple examples, and to start prototyping. We're very interested in putting our research to use and getting it out into the field. So also prototyping sort of tools, doing little experiments with partners that sit outside of MIT. And then Cortico participates in helping construct some of these prototypes. Technology tools for journalists would be an example of a kind of tool. And then what we mean by deploy is there's no interesting research questions left, but we think there's actually some value in a piece of technology that's emerged from our lab, and we want to make that available in a and maintained as a tool for, say, journalists in newsrooms across the country but there may not be much of a business to build. If you follow what's happening in the news industry, that's usually the case. And so we think there's an interesting space for nonprofit organization that has kind of technology or engineering capabilities and that is linked in interesting ways to academic labs. So that is the sort of division of labor between these two groups. So what I'm going to do is sketch two pieces of research that have come out of our lab that have led us to start thinking about this notion of ailments of the public sphere, ailments in the nature of public discourse, and everything I'm going to talk about today, both past, present, and planned, are within the context of the United States. So I'm going to show you two examples of what we mean by, or have come to think of as ailments. And then I'm going to talk about this idea of metrics, or sort of measuring health of the public sphere, and show you some of what we're actually working on internally at the lab, within our lab. And I'll end by explaining how some of these metrics we think could lead to behavior change and some of the different stakeholders of the public sphere in a US context that we are starting to plan, or in some cases actually start experiments in using these metrics. So the first ailment, I think some of you may be aware, we did some research that was published recently in Science, in fact with our companion paper, I guess at least one author in the room today. Two. And what we did in this paper, it actually goes back, the sort of history of this work, to the Boston Marathon bombing, when both my student Soroush, at the time he was a PhD student in my lab, Soroush Vasugi, who was the first author of this paper, and I were in lockdown, as perhaps many of you experienced during the manhunt after the Boston Marathon bombing. I actually got my wife finally to join Twitter in those 48 hours that we were in our house with our children, not explaining to our kids why we are not going to leave the house, and learning via Twitter what was actually happening in the environment around us. My student Soroush was experiencing the same thing in Cambridge, we were in Belmont. When the dust settled after the manhunt was over, we realized a lot of what we thought was happening, like there was a second bomb that had gone off in Harvard Square, that it was the missing Brown student that was the suspect, that there was a lot of false news, a lot of rumors that turned out not to be true mixed in with what was true. And so we decided to drop Soroush's PhD plans and instead track these retweet cascades, essentially find tangible data traces of rumors as they spread through Twitter. And we began with some of the Boston Marathon bombing rumors that we had personally experienced. And the question we started with, this is 5 years ago, this is not the Science paper, I'm just giving you the context, is if we could at some point in time sort of trace back to where the rumor started, or maybe in multiple places, and then find a moment where the rumor is confirmed or denied by a credible source. And we looked at fact-checking orgs, we looked at credible news sources, we looked at Wikipedia, which would often compile and curate those various sources. And then the question we asked is, if you go back in time from when that first credible confirmation or denial of a rumor was made, could you actually find any predictive signal in the way the rumor spread on Twitter that would predict its ultimate veracity according to that credible source? So that was a question we began with 5 years ago. What we found, what Soroush found in his PhD thesis, is yes, there is some predictive signal. Some of it is in the kind of language that's used to talk about a piece of news, a kind of assertion. Some of it was who was doing the talking, and some of it was actually the structure of the diffusion patterns themselves. And in fact, in his thesis, he found that was the single most predictive element. Sinan Aral was a committee member. He joined Soroush's thesis committee, and I think soon after, like the day after the defense was over, Sinan said, hey, why don't we sort of double click on that most predictive element and just understand it in a more comprehensive and systematic way. And so then Soroush and Sinan worked closely on sort of phase 2 and essentially built a database of a large collection. This is just over time, you know, you have a tweet, someone tweets, another bomb went off in Harvard Square, and a number of people then retweet that specific tweet. This structure we called a cascade, a retweet cascade, and the question was, if you collected a very large set of these for what we call contested news, stories that had been fact-checked by one of 6 different fact-checking organizations. So we built a database of contested stories, found retweet cascades spanning roughly a decade on Twitter, so going back historically, and asked a simple question. The ones that turn out, according to these sources, to be true versus false, if you just break them into 2 categories, do the 2 clusters of cascades look different? We already knew the answer would be yes, because we knew from Sush's thesis that there was predictive signal there, but in what ways did they differ? I'm actually, because I have a lot of material I want to get through, I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but these are, each of these plots in green are some description, some characteristic of the true versus what, according to fact checkers, is a false story across a collection of over 100,000, about 126,000 cascades, constituting about 4.5 million actual tweet and retweet data points. And the summary is, yes, green and red look very different, and in plain English, the false news stories in aggregate tend to propagate faster, further in terms of breadth of the cascades, the depth, how many times on average a piece of false news is retweeted. In every sense, you can say falsity dominates truth for this category of contested news. So that was sort of the key finding in sort of looking at the difference between these diffusions. Also, then, one of the things that Soroush looked at was, if you go back here, every time someone tweets or retweets, if you use Twitter, you know that you can also reply to a tweet, and you can reply to a reply, so you get these little threads of replies. So what is the emotion? Is there any kind of pattern in the emotions expressed in the replies to these contested news stories? And is there, again, a difference between the ones that turn out to be true versus false? And this is just showing that of a set of 8 emotions, there's a standard dictionary that, based on what words appear in the replies, we systematically tag the replies by emotion. Imperfect, but in aggregate, a pretty good way to get a sense of emotional content. What we actually found was surprise and disgust were the 2 emotions that correlated with, and in general, if it was false, it was more likely to lead to expressions of surprise and disgust in the reply, which suggests, obviously, we can't go back in time and ask people, were you disgusted when you hit the retweet button? And is that why you retweeted? But there is a reasonable causal story that this suggests that one might want to go and try to tease out. So back to this was the cover image from the Science magazine. We like to visualize patterns. So this, you might say, is a visual depiction of the struggle between falsity and truth when it comes to contested news. And unfortunately, the fiery orange one is in this case falsity. That's one visualization of an actual cascade, and that's a representative of a true cascade. We do see this pattern for contested news. We don't know what the pattern looks like for all of news, whatever that might mean. But at least for this particular category, which we think is super important, it sort of leads to enough confusion and controversy that fact-checking orgs with limited resources decide to go and evaluate that there is a systematic bias. And remember, in general, when someone is deciding to hit the retweet button, there's no reason to believe they know what the truth is of the story, right? And so that perhaps it is some kind of emotional reaction. Further, just kind of one were to speculate, it's easier to be surprising if you're not bound to reality. It's easier when you're just making up stuff, and maybe add a touch of disgust, and you really get the effect you're looking for. Science magazine decided to call, on their title, they said the spread of lies, how lies spread. And I think I was surprised that they went with that on the cover, but it's reasonable to say that these contested stories, when you look at them, they were intentionally fabricated stories. But it's also, there's a lot of subtlety here. The person who decides to share it may not be intentionally spreading a lie. They're just a unwitting part of a chain, perhaps. Or maybe they are doing it on purpose. Maybe they're a bot, although we did quite a bit of work to see whether this was a bot effect. This is one of the surprises, I think, for a lot of people in the study, that well, we concluded it was not primarily bots that were driving this difference. But you have to keep in mind, as you take that finding, that we were looking over the course of a decade, and bot warfare has evolved rapidly recently. And a second thing is, Twitter internally does a lot of work to filter bots. But if any of you do research with Twitter data and rely on the real-time API, which is what most academic labs use, that's before it's been filtered, because the real-time feed. Once the bot filtering kicks in, wait a minute or two. In other words, if you look at historical data, much of anything that Twitter's internal bot detection thinks is a bot, you will not be able to retrieve because the data is gone. So this whole study was done with historical data, so we had that filter in place. Okay, so specimen 1 of a form of ailment raises interesting questions. If you think of all of Twitter as a kind of landscape, like a Twitter sphere, which parts of Twitter land have more of this? Are there parts of the environment, that surface of the public sphere, where you're more likely to run into false information? Are there certain enabling conditions? Are there certain actors or certain factors that are predictive of having more of this sort of stuff? So that's a sort of question, and can we start to think about ways to create an index or sort of measurement of that?
May I ask you a question on that?
Yeah.
So to a certain extent, Twitter is the fast, sensational place.
Mhm.
If you have fast, sensational news, that's where you would want to go. Have you thought about seeing if the same patterns in terms of the correlates with specific emotions and the different speed of fake versus real replicating in email or in Facebook or in other platforms? And would you hypothesize that it would replicate?
So, with the obvious caveat, pure guesswork now, right, and sort of intuition. Well, first of all, yes, we have thought about it. We have wondered. Second, to state the obvious, it's kind of hard to get at the data, especially in call it the post-Cambridge Analytica era.
Right.
So we have like sort of two phases of research on electronic or digital communication. We're in that second era. It seems reasonable that you'd see similar things. There's a lot of studies that, we know that you're more likely to share bad news over good news. If something is surprising, it's almost definitional. If it's not surprising, this is kind of a sort of Shannon information theoretic sense of this, then it's not informative. It's not surprising you. So certain things around the emotional response, and that's connected to informativeness. I don't know how much of this is because you're absolutely right that Twitter is a place where it's a live medium. It's you kind of move quickly and it's designed for speed. So what about word of mouth at the Sunday barbecue? That's a slower pace.
Mm-hmm.
But is the basic dynamic of word of mouth, of what you decide, of all the things you heard to share with your friends at the barbecue, different when you had more time to think and reflect? I don't know. But maybe people here, others in the room now, I don't know. I'd love to understand to what degree this is correlated with behavior in other channels. There's certainly differences, right, between word of mouth and the amplification effects of Twitter. You can also share news or anything on Facebook. There is no retweet on Instagram. So each of these services, there's a little, not so little, design decisions in the product, which may have massive differences in how things diffuse and sort of the properties of the information quality. I'm not sure, quite honestly, any of the designers fully appreciate it. I don't think they could have, but now as a system, we can see. Twitter is unique in its level of observability. From its origins, it was meant to be a public medium, and so we were able to leverage that. We're using publicly available access points, but we just had very high rate limits were lifted for us to be able to do comprehensive study, but it's very different on other platforms like email. Unless you're on Enron and you really mess up, and some judge decides to release the corpus, yeah, it's kind of hard to do. Yeah.
This is very depressing thinking about how fast false information propagates, but the collection of data you had was a tiny bit of all the data that are propagated on a daily basis. And in fact, the characteristic, talking about the selection bias there, is these are the data that the fact checkers decided to look at. So don't you think that what you have found tells us a little more about what fact checkers like to study rather than what happens out there? Because if that was really happening in life, then we had 6 times faster false news than true. The world would not work, it seems to me. You could not operate in such a false environment. What do you think?
I think it's a great point. And so the question of how important is this study is kind of what you're asking. I don't
How wide?
Right. Yeah. And if it's if it turns out that most of our environment is, let's say, that is presented as true, probably is true, or maybe our instinct for detecting when something's false, just knowing, well, that we expect that to be, or we can just tell it's false, and it turns out, let's say most of the time our intuitions are correct, so we can sort of sort. Then one might say that the relatively minor subset where we get things wrong could have undue impact, right? So if one were to try to turn up the importance of this, I could make an argument like that. On the other hand, it might be a somewhat depressing view that diminishes the value of this, which is actually there's a lot of that going on when no fact-checking organization looks at it and our intuitions are wrong. Or, as I'm going to try to suggest soon, veracity may not even be the most important thing to be studying at all. Of course, you can never fact-check your way out of, we all are in an interesting moment in America where the public sphere seems to be slipping into something new territory for us, more akin to what we see in other parts of the world, but there's a shift in our confidence that facts are even knowable. Our confidence that we can trust any source is slipping. I don't think it's just people in this room, by the way. I think this is true in rural Rust Belt America as well. We also, I think, all have this sense that we fear others are gullibly believing what they're getting from a single source, and that seems to be pervasive as well, interestingly. So I don't know how to place it in that larger context, but we think it's important, or we wouldn't have studied it. But how to get your arms around what is the overall scope and what's the impact or importance of this. We did a small sample of about 10% the size of these cascades that were drawn from similar sources as the stories that are fact-checked but had never been fact-checked. And we did our own fact-checking internally with 3 students and Google. Assuming Google's true, right? Everything Google says is true. So, we found similar patterns with that 10% sample. Again, not representative of all news because it's not even clear how you define that. If you take a random uniform sample of all links on Twitter, most of it you probably wouldn't consider as news. And so we sort of, but starting from here, we did take a sample that had never been, where the public had never seen the result of a fact check, and we found a similar pattern. So there is something, I think, I would interpret that as the kind of emotional response or the nature of the stories that tend to be true versus false from similar kinds of sources. Maybe there's a similar pattern. Beyond that, hard to know how much further generalized or what the overall impact is. Cool. So we also about 5 years ago, as we were, I have been at MIT for a long time, but I took, as you heard in my too long bio, I took a break and built a company. And when I returned to MIT about 5 years ago, along with the rumor study, we wanted to look at kind of patterns at the intersection of social media and news around how people talk about and how journalists talk about current events. And it was about 2014. We said, let's pick an event that should give off some good signal at the intersection of news and social media. And we're like, well, the election should be a good thing to point our focus on.
So you didn't foresee that those two blondes would be the subjects.
We did not know who the subjects would be, but we did know there would be a campaign that would give off a lot of news and Twitter coverage. So we built a partnership we already had with Twitter and Knight and a number of other partners. And essentially, and this is a lot of detail, I'll just sort of summarize by saying we built a technology stack, a kind of analytics platform that had two inputs, tweets, and we were scraping about 30 different news sources, English language, American national news sources. This included things like CNN and Politico. It also included, I guess it's not listed here, but Breitbart was in this list, BuzzFeed, New York Times, etc. So what we were doing was fishing out of the fire hose of tweets, English language, American time zone source tweets and stories. Stories and tweets that our automatic classification determined were probably about the presidential election. And then we automatically tagged the content, both the tweets and the stories, in terms of what issues. I know you can't read this, but things like energy and LGBT and terrorism and healthcare. And so we worked with the Washington Post, established 19 area topics, and just started tagging. So we're interested in particular, how people are talking about the issues and how they've been covered in news. And so we sort of organized this, just to kind of give you a sense of what we started doing. And the idea was, I know this is a little washed out, but this is the first story in the Washington Post that ran in late December of 2015. So this says November 1st to December 13th. That says foreign policy, that says immigration, that says racial issues. And each of these bands that is varying over time is the number of tweets that were about the election and tagged as being about that particular issue. So you can see some ebb and flow of kind of the attention of people on Twitter. And you see a sudden jump in the conversation about guns, and then after a few days it kind of dies down. That was actually the moment of the San Bernardino shooting. And so you could also start to see exogenous events and their impact on the conversation and also the timescale. So the point of this, and actually a whole bunch of stories we ended up helping newsrooms produce, was to treat Twitter as a complement or an alternative window into what was going on in the country, an alternative to focus groups and polls. And we weren't trying to predict outcomes. We weren't trying to say these were better than polls, but they were certainly different. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Could you remind us, how does the Twitter population compare to the U.S. Census figure?
Sure. So Twitter is overrepresented for African Americans, underrepresents people over the age of 50. So there's an age skew, there's some race skews. I think gender-wise, it's pretty close, and then there's other subtle.
SES.
I would imagine certainly there's going to be some bias towards upper SES being on Twitter. Pew does a yearly study across all the major platforms and publishes these biases. Yeah.
So the major one we should keep in mind then is age and race.
Those are two. Those are two that come to mind first. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, there's a third important one, which is less about who's on the platform, but what kind of things you're willing to talk about or you tend to talk about. And so one of the things that I don't have here, but the Washington Post, they actually designed an ABC Washington Post poll where they asked what issue is most important to you as you consider who you're going to vote for this election cycle. And they matched the categories with the 19 issues that we were tracking, since we work with them in establishing those issues. And basically, and then they ran a nationally representative poll. And the finding was, wow, this looks totally different than Twitter. Okay? And then and it was interesting because then they wrote a story and they published the side by side. You can find this on Washington Post's archives. And they just look totally different. Like what people said were important, things like employment, hardly register in comparative terms on Twitter. You look on Twitter and it's things like immigration and foreign policy, but those are actually not the most important in general when you ask in polls. And all that Washington Post could do was kind of a shoulder shrug, like, well, they're different. And actually, although they might not have said this, it's like, well, here's what public opinion is, polls, and then here's this weird signal on Twitter. And I think that, I'm not saying they said that, but if one were to say that, I'd say that's wrong. It's just, here's one signal, here's another signal. Neither are sort of fully representative, because what kind of strange person answers a stranger's call and when they say, do you have 15 minutes to talk to a stranger? Yeah, sure. What do you want to know? Like, what kind of strange person does that anymore? Well, those are the people who fill in the poll for the Post. And equally strange, who would possibly just shout out what they think about politics into the wild for whoever's willing to listen? And unless you think about talk radio local call-ins, the original tweet before there was Twitter, no one. So that is a weird behavior, although there are certain people who do that too. So we just got these
traditional
shoot
telephone polls have been replaced by all this data analytics in the New York Times each day and studies like yours that add up what people tweet.
I'm not saying it's been replaced. I'm just saying it's harder and harder to get people to answer the phone or open the door. We actually had some interaction with the Iowa State poll, the oldest poll in the country, and once upon a time they had a army of people fan out and knock on doors, and people would open the doors and they'd talk and they'd ask some kind of structured survey questions, they'd ask some open-ended questions, and they'd publish the results and create this awareness of what your neighbors think. Boy, have those times changed, right?
One other tilt I should know in Twitter data, I think we found that a substantial partisan bias, right? So substantial tilt towards Democrats, which is consequential for this kind of analysis. Part of that is the age gradient, since there's a huge
That's a
age
great point.
gradient. How do you deal with the fact that there are also a lot of non-humans, and not just bots, there are a lot of bots, but also the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times are also all on Twitter and very active and creating, single-handedly affecting what is seen. So there's this weird iterative, reflective process.
So those are two different problems or issues. How do you know these are people versus bots? And then what about the feedback effects of the media themselves? I don't think there is anything to do about the second. That's just pointing out, I think, a really important point, which is when people are focused on what's happening on one of these platforms, Twitter, Facebook, that they are so deeply entangled with other parts of the communication ecosystem. And there's no doubt, I think Gary King's, the paper that came out a while back showing the kind of causal interactions, but it's we've also looked at how television immediately sparks conversation on social media. So they're clearly driving one another, but First Draft, which is happening somewhere around here, is trying to actually sever the feedback loop from social media back into the newsrooms, right? So they're all entangled. In terms of bots, we did some filtering here. I would say we didn't aggressively filter for bots in some of the content. We did some. We used the Indiana University's bot filtering, and then something I'm about to show you. We started to get more careful and aggressive in the bot filtering in order look at sort of social networks of what we believe are humans. Great. So, by the way, it was also an interesting exercise. We were invited by the Commission on Presidential Debates to brief the moderators. So if you go between each debate based on patterns of what people are saying on Twitter, are there some suggested questions that emerge from the patterns of tweets? And so we did some fun experiments, provided a briefings book, and were able to suggest some questions, which look similar to some of the questions that were asked. Who knows what actually happens once the moderator goes closed doors before each debate. But so let me now share with you a second kind of image of what we started thinking of as an ailment. This is a sample of a couple of million accounts. We're visualizing a subset, a representative subset. These are, so let me just describe what this data set is. From over a 3-month period in the summer of 2016, so kind of centered on the primaries, anyone who tweeted at least once about an election-related issue, one of those 19 issues, we would take that account from Twitter and put it into into Corpus, and then we ended up with this collection of accounts, and then we looked at the follower graph of who follows who, and extracted the mutual follower graph. This means 2 accounts that are following each other. We also did applied some bot filtering from other labs. So we ended up with this graph. This is a forced layout of the mutual follower graph. We're interested in mutual follower. It tends to be the case, not always the case, but it tends to be if 2 people follow each other on Twitter, they're more likely to know each other in real life. And so we were interested in trying to expose the social graph structure of Twitter for the people who are politically active in the summer. This was a snapshot taken a couple of months after the summer, I think early October. So the primaries are complete. We color-coded based on what issue the tweet, the account was tweeting about. There was no obvious, there's obviously structure here, a very strong clique and some other structure within, but no clear connection between what they're talking about and where they are in this graph. However, when we recolor without touching the layout, this graph, based on something we called political tribe membership, and we had a very simple definition of what whether a Twitter user was in a tribe. We looked at all of the candidates that ran in the primaries, and if a count only followed one of the candidates at the exclusion of the rest, we call that an exclusive follower. So if you only follow Bernie Sanders, but you don't follow Clinton, you don't follow Trump, et cetera, you're part of the Sanders tribe. And so we define tribes in this way for all the candidates. If you recolor, suddenly there's a very clear structure. This is the Trump tribe, users who only follow Trump. There's actually a magenta. The single biggest color here is actually not a tribe by that membership, but it's accounts that only follow Trump and Clinton. So this is, again, this is October. In blue, and I apologize that it's a little washed out, but there is a band of blue. The number of nodes in the blue is roughly equal to the number of nodes in red, and that is the Clinton tribe. And there is actually a third major tribe in green. It's got sort of 2 parts. One part has mutual follow connections into the Trump tribe. And this is the Sanders tribe. So there's a couple of interesting things here. It's a couple of months after the primaries are over, and there's 3 tribes, not 2. The next biggest tribe was the Cruz tribe, which was about 1/10 the size of the Trump tribe, so it wasn't even worth visualizing here. Second is just obviously the strong coherence of the Trump tribe. A lot of interconnections between these, which we did not find for Sanders or Clinton. And really what we started to take most interest in was just a lack of connection, right, between this group and the rest, right? It's a little bit of connection into part of the Sanders, so you might start to eyeball the kind of insurrectionist tendency that is not about the ideology, but more about kind of anti-system. I don't know. And the last thing here, if you take a sample of journalists that wrote stories about the election in that same period, so we collected, extracted the names of journalists, about 30,000 journalists, and then we identified them on Twitter. Most journalists are active on Twitter. And if you locate where the journalists are in this picture, pulsating in blue and in yellow are all the verified and unverified journalists that wrote about the election, one of the 30 papers that we're tracking. And so it just kind of reinforces a disconnect, right? So without trying to look, and we are very interested in what is being said and what's different about the kind of points of view, but just the disconnect, and actually where most of the journalists who are writing are situated in this map, is actually a second example of what gave rise in our lab to this notion of, hey, there are like these ailments, like this looks like the patient is sick. And it has to do partly with the topology, and then we did other studies, which I won't show you today, in tracing how links are shared or media is shared, and this is where we start connecting with the idea of cascades. That, as you might imagine, a lot of things that are shared here stay here. And you can fact check and publish fact checking all you want, but if there's just a fragmented nature of the network, there's certain things that just don't get across. Yeah.
I mean, on Twitter,
Mm-hmm.
who follows whom is often a signal of identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so that reporters may choose not to follow various may not declare themselves as belonging to the Trump tribe.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that they don't get information.
Yeah. To be clear, being here doesn't mean you don't follow Trump, right? It just means if you have to be here, you only follow Trump. If you're
only
red,
follow Trump and not
right.
one of
And
the
so
other.
it's not a surprise that most journalists are following, after the primaries, multiple candidates. But to be in the Trump tribe, you exclusively follow Trump. So does that make sense?
Yeah, but I'm just not sure what the statement is that you're trying to make that this is an ailment.
Oh, it's a picture of a isolated fragment that I think we are being, this is my personal feeling now, this is not the data, this is just a statement about what's happened to our media ecosystem. I think we have a polarized media ecosystem, and for some reason I feel like, I would get a lot of questions about, so Deb, so are those the racists? Are those the misogynists? Those are the brainwashed people. And I'm like, no, I doubt it. It's like, that's just a small sample from Twitter, but kind of to me that's a picture of, I don't know, maybe a third of the country. And so what are they saying? So we start to drill in and try to analyze the language. We spent a lot of time with journalists and increasingly with pollsters. And I just got the sense that a lot of the people that you're blinking right here couldn't answer the question any better than me. And that there is a kind of caricatures being served up of other tribes. And the fact that there is a strong pattern to where the journalists are and where they are not, I think is directly related to both the fragmented nature of the network and the poor visibility we have of other people in the country.
But these are the subset of journalists that belong to the tribe. So if you don't belong to this, I guess, democratic tribe, right, the ones on the left-hand side, then you won't show up in this graph.
If you don't belong,
So
you'll.
if you follow both primary candidates of one party or the other, will you show up in this graph?
If you, as a journalist, if you wrote a story about the election in this period and our algorithm classified your story, that's the first criteria. Second is we identified the journalists on Twitter. And the third is you had at least one mutual follow with this sample of, I think it was about 1 million accounts. Then you would be placed onto this image. And then your location in the image would be automatically determined by the force layout graph, which is trying to put highly connected accounts near each other. That's the steps to derive this picture. And I'm not expressing surprise that journalists are in general not showing up here. There are a few unverified journals here. I'm instead saying this rendered a picture of how many of us in our lab felt by the time the election was over. There's a question there, and then there, and then there. Yeah.
Very brief. You looked at how people block each other as well.
Block?
Block, yeah. I think
We
it's
have
a
it.
very neglected sort of
Yeah.
relation.
Yeah.
Not following.
I'm not sure we can. I don't know if you can actually see that. There's a lot of things that are on Twitter, but there's no API level access. Even like getting a stream of what people are like, what people like, is not in the standard API. By the way, so that's my brief answer. On signaling by who you follow, I also don't think that's primarily people signal by tweeting or retweeting, but the fact that you're following someone is usually not, if you follow 1,000 people, I don't think it's I don't know this, but I would guess most people's mindset, users of Twitter, are not that they're putting on display who they're following. You have to actually do a lot of work to see who someone's following. Because you have to page through and it's reverse chronological, the follows. So I don't think it's much of a signal in that sense. It's visible, but not much of a signal.
So I had two sets of questions on this. One of these is how much of this is cause and how much is effect?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that fell out of the election was this, as in many of the elections, the critique on the far right, or perhaps a subset of ultra-conservatives, of the media's bias.
Mm-hmm.
So might it be the case that they choose within that group not to follow the folks in the media because they believe they're not biased, or because they don't follow them, then they'll accuse them of the bias? So where's the cause and where's the effect in here?
Yeah.
That was just the first question. The second question is, how much can we use this diagnostic tool as cure?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, on the one hand, there's a question of how would you use this to go about identifying fake news and propagating or not propagating fake news? At a deeper level might be the question, that's a pretty disconnected society.
Mm-hmm.
But could you use that to connect the society differently?
Mm-hmm.
Could Twitter rejigger a few of the nodes in there in a way that you might actually be able to cause better information dissemination?
Mm-hmm.
There's
Great.
two sets of questions in there.
So I think the simple answer to your first question is I don't know. It's like what's causing what. It's complex, and I think my opinion is, my speculation is no more valuable than yours or anyone else in the room. So let me take a pass on that right now, partly because I've gone too long as well. The second actually is the remaining 2/3 of my talk, which I obviously will not get through, but and I don't think is purely on Twitter, but I'll at least give you some highlights of what we're up to. Remember I said I was going to spend a little bit of time talking about past work and then mainly about future, so I obviously have messed that up. It began with getting lost on a campus I've been to a million times, but there's one more question and then I'll...
It was me, but I'm gonna hold my question so
Okay.
we can get through more.
Great. So, actually, a little bit to your question of what's causing what. I just want to make a point that there is I think it's really important to realize the entanglement between truth and trust, and if you are, in that one of those tribes, actually it doesn't matter which one, that separate from is this asserted fact, is this rumor true or false, and the fact that we care about veracity and we think about fact checking and so forth, do I trust the source from which this news or this information is coming? And there's not just do I trust that it's true or false, but do I trust that it matters? Which is it's an orthogonal question, right? Is this important? Should I be paying attention? When the New York Times runs a headline that says the inauguration crowd size was much smaller, separate from is that true or false, is that really the most important thing I need to know today? And so I think there's this, I think often a kind of a conflation between these two. It's interesting when Gallup asked 19,000 Americans to define fake news, each of those senses, one being true information that goes against my tribe and false information, both were senses of fake news that a majority of Americans have in mind. So it's actually it's right there in how we define fake news. It's not just about veracity, it's about tribes. Okay, so metrics, let me see, I'm gonna try to finish in 15 minutes. So I'll just say, we started off, this is about a year ago, I organized a seminar called Depolarization by Design. You might recognize some of the people that we had come and talk about polarization and other related topics. I'll just say that what happened by the end of this incredible seminar, we've recorded it all, so if you're interested, it's all online, is we shifted and we decided that we should have actually called the class not Depolarization by Design. How do you design communication systems that tend towards depolarization? We actually decided we should have called it Defragmentation by Design. So we sort of end up with this picture of like, this is what bad looks like if you think the public sphere, which plays a role in democracy, and if the unit you're analyzing is public sphere for America, that sort of fragmentation is a bad thing. And if we were thinking about metrics, beyond just saying what are things that are ailments, can we actually think about metrics that can guide behaviors towards moving the public sphere in a good direction, right? And if good is grounded out, if fragmentation is bad, what are the things you can do to sort of defragment the public sphere? So that is the framing we adopted. And one last piece of framing is I've done a lot of work within a context of Twitter. I spent a lot of time talking to folks at Facebook, and I've seen a similar pattern, which is the policies that focus on bad behavior and how you police a platform, they tend to all be in terms of what I'll call the micro level. Is this user of the platform crossing a line? Is this post, this tweet, this post, some kind of specific action crossing a policy line? If so, take an action. You might say remove, that's extreme. You might say slow down, it's diffusion. Hide it, block it. There's various things that platforms can do, but they're operating at the micro level. What's about to unfold next week in congressional hearings, you might call the macro level, which is public hearings that sort of raise the question, is Twitter bad? Is Facebook really bad? And how is it bad? At a platform level. These are, of course, platforms that are serving hundreds of millions and billions of people. Call it the macro level. Our work led us to focus on what you might call the meso level. And you can call them tribes, groups, clusters, but they're sort of groups of people. And in particular, what's the dynamic between groups? And that is, I'm not saying that is the only level of analysis that matters, but if you want to define metrics for public sphere, we think this is a very important level of analysis. You can never stop doing this. This is why platforms are now scaling up to tens of thousands of people to work on policing. But what we find when you go into the conversations with the platforms is there's actually very little established policy or even vocabulary for talking about this meso level. And yet, when we're looking at, say, those tribal networks, that's exactly the level that our focus. Yeah.
So are there, I can imagine easily policies that operate at the micro level, like you mentioned, you can take an action. And I can imagine metrics that can be measured at the meso or macro level.
Yep.
But are there policies which can be enforced at the meso level?
Hold that thought. Okay. So here's our framing. All right, you got two, let's call them tribes, and you have the world. Imagine, and this is conceptual, and then I'll give you a little sneak of some things we're actually building according to this conceptualization. Imagine a tribe has a focus of attention. This is what is the yellow tribe thinking about? What are they sharing? So it's sort of their attention. I think of it, it's like an attentional spotlight. So of course, the purple tribe has its own, and this is dynamic. So over time, these shift. So the idea is, if you were to analyze the intersection of these spotlights, you have this notion of shared attention. This idea that you can ask this question, is there overlap in what we talk about? Okay. And beyond just a kind of conceptual picture, if you have access to appropriate data, you can maybe not measure it directly, but you can measure proxies or shared attention. You can also ask, are we using the same facts? Is there not only a shared attention, but shared reality? So a simple example, fans of two different teams, are they actually paying attention to the same game that's just been played? Do they actually agree with who won and who lost? And by the way, this doesn't directly ground out in veracity. It might be that the two tribes have a shared reality that some omniscient fact checker determines is false. This is just asking a question, is there alignment? Okay? From one perspective to the other, and these are nested. If you don't have a shared attention, you can't have shared reality. If you do have shared reality, we agree on who won and who lost. Are we now aware, mutually aware, that there's another point of view? That I'm happy with the outcome, but you're unhappy, right? Do I know, as members of this group, that there's actually another point of view on that same reality? And again, this is this question of varied perspectives. Do we have exposure to other points of view about a shared reality? And finally, what's a reaction to those alternate points of view? Are we open? Are we civil? Is there a signals of tolerance? So these we call principles for designing health indicators, kind of indicators of public sphere health. They're all defined in terms of pairwise interaction between groups. There's no doubt other things one should be measuring at the micro level. There are other things you will want to be measuring within groups. This is a complicated space, but this is a place that we've decided to focus because of our interest in fragmentation and defragmentation. And the sense is, let's just be extreme. If we just have failure over a sustained period of time in shared attention or shared reality, the ability to in any way build consensus or have a sense of common ground is nil. If this applies not just in Twitter, most people don't spend most of their time on Twitter. That'd be a very strange person, right? But if you take all of the mediated elements of our environment, because most of what we know about the rest of the country is, of course, mediated. We only know a few hundred people. The rest is a mediated understanding. If there is kind of sort of a high level of failure for shared attention or shared reality, it's a problem. If you don't realize that your view is not the only view, we think that's a problem. We think if you are dismissive or intolerant towards that other point of view, we're not saying there shouldn't be arguments, there shouldn't be collisions, but if there is a kind of pattern of this sort of these four principles, we think these are the things that are worth measuring. It's not just, of course, that there's two groups, but if you now start to scale this out, imagine you have 3 tribes. You can fill in the upper diagonal of this matrix in terms of these health indicators. And if you now scale this, and take United States, I don't know, you might have 1,000 segments. So open research question is how to segment a large population. There's various community detection algorithms, but there's a lot of different ways you can start thinking of these segments. What does the pattern holistically look like? And if you have certain bad actors or certain groups that are showing systematic behaviors with respect to others, there should be patterns that pop out when you do this across the whole system. These first 5 are areas, sources of media data that to varying degrees we've started working on. We're actually doing, because I came in late, I don't have my talk radio demo set up. If anyone of you are interested, as I mentioned before, someone calling in to local talk radio, you might think of as the original tweet before there was an internet. Imagine if you can monitor that at scale countrywide. And it's interesting to note that if you're on television or you're on radio, you're also very active on Twitter and probably on Facebook. And so there are entanglements between these different platforms that we can trace algorithmically. Yes?
The colors in the health of the public sphere, what do the colors represent?
I'm sorry, I stole this from the internet. This has nothing to do with the public sphere. This is purely to describe the concept of what we're going to build out over the next few years. Yeah. I think this might be like some kind of a chemistry lab readout of like proteins or something. Okay.
I thought red was competing with yellow, like good versus evil. Or evil versus good.
That would have been a better answer. We're out of time. I just if anyone's interested, we actually are now doing computations of shared attention and reality automatically. We're actually looking at sharing patterns of links being shared between different, this is 3 tribes, and we're actually processing the underlying stories automatically using NLP and doing a first estimate of to what degree there's shared assertion of facts between stories. We also have started doing the sort of receptivity, civility index scoring across Twitter and talk radio. So we have little pieces of what I just described working. In the last 5 minutes, let me just cruise through and say, okay, imagine we go from stolen internet picture of health to actual, right? So, and we have some early prototypes that we're going to scale up. So we have some kind of health indicators, or let's say a public health index. There are things that we believe if you run a platform, you might think about changing that could improve the health of that part of the public sphere you touch. True also of publishers. True if you're an advertiser, if you're a social media or a kind of media influencer. And finally, there are things that maybe groups of people could do in terms of behavior change. So this is a, I'll just kind of give you a sense of, so Jack Dorsey, the co-founder and CEO of Twitter about a month ago, tweeted, it says, we're committing Twitter to help increase the, what did he say? The something, I can't even read this now. The collective health, right? Openness, thank you. So the thing I really want to emphasize is, look, he cited us. So our friends at Cortico and Social Machines introduced us to the concept of measuring conversational health. They came up with 4 indicators: shared attention, shared reality, variety of opinion, receptivity. Read about their work. So this is a commitment from Twitter, not to just take our health indicators and optimize their platform, but instead work in parallel with us and develop their internal interpretation of health indicators and optimize, if you will, have a second bottom line along with engagement or time on platform, which translates into revenue, recognizing that they need to shift gears. So we have a deep relationship with Twitter. They're very aware of what we're doing, and we're going to be taking some of the ideas that I just started to sketch for you and work with their research team to say what's the version of this that only Twitter can ever actually build, because Twitter has access to internal data that we never will on the outside. And we don't want that internal access, but we want to do something from the outside and couple it with what's happening inside. Copy and paste everything I just said as the app's aspirational for other platforms like Facebook and YouTube. And we think that's an interesting model. But that's not the only leverage point for the public sphere ecosystem. Publishers carry outsized impact. At that meso level, a single publisher like the New York Times can actually have meso level impact. They can't change impact of the whole platform typically. But if one publisher is reaching a few million people, by our use of the term meso, you've reached meso scale. So we're doing an initial experiment. Again, I'll just kind of give you the quickest sense. Frontline investigative journalism program at PBS. Their executive director, Rainey Aronson, came to us with an interesting challenge. Let me just kind of put this out. Let me just summarize by saying we're working with Frontline to depolarize the reach of their content online. They've run into a very interesting problem in the history of Frontline. If you know the program, when it was televised and then streamed online, they had a very politically balanced audience, and that has changed in the era of Facebook and Twitter. And so we are actually working with them to map out cascades, propagation cascades of their content on Twitter. We're looking at the political balance of who is propagating their content, and we're using that to actually design experiments where they try to intentionally get their content to bridge and then monitor to what degree the reception to that content is civil and tolerant across political boundaries, in a way that if they don't put some marketing muscle in, things are tending to polarize. And there's a longer story there for why that may be happening that I'd be happy to unpack. Influencers, again, just very briefly. This is an influencer. This is Bridget Mendler. If any of you have teenage kids, they probably know that she played Teddy in Good Luck Charlie. She then went on to a incredibly successful career as a singer-songwriter. She has hundreds of millions of views on YouTube. She had a top single in Spotify last fall. She has millions, 5 million followers on Twitter, 7 million on Facebook. So this is what I mean by a social media influencer. And if you watch what she's doing on Twitter, it looks a little unusual. She tweets things like this regularly. What's the most interesting thing you learned in school recently? She asks her 5 million high school aged fan base. And this guy got a scholarship, and she gave him a high five, and that led to a private, longer exchange of people actually saying how cool it is that Bridget Mendler thought your scholarship was cool. This is a visualization of a conversation tree, a reply thread that is being driven by Bridget's tweets. And the question we have is, can you actually build a tool for a celebrity like Bridget that is interested in a second bottom line? So the whole industry for influencers, there's an incredible machine that's been built up of metrics and tools and consultants and agencies. And the name of the game is very simple. Maximize your fan base so you can monetize. A celebrity like Bridget will make tens of thousands of dollars for a single tweet. So you just tweet advertisements. And the cool thing is Bridget joined our lab. She's learned how to program Python and D3, so she built the tool that created this visualization. As she's starting to create species of conversation trees that she feels are healthy and unhealthy, we're developing a coding scheme, machine learning, to actually recognize the signatures of kind of healthy discourse. That is informing the indices that we want to develop. And meanwhile, we think, in fact, more importantly, Bridget thinks that a lot of her peers are actually interested in having a second way to sort of keep score. So this need for alternate measures, it's not just something we think that publishers care about, but influencers as well. Advertisers, if you've watched what's been happening with Laura Ingraham, if you remember what happened with Kellogg's and a boycott to pull advertising out of Breitbart, and Breitbart countering and asking the readers to boycott Kellogg's, David Hogg calling for advertisers to pull out from Laura Ingraham. There are these kind of erratic surprises waiting for every brand, unless you have a systematic way to know where the healthy parts of the public sphere are, where you might want to systematically build your brand. And so we have started some very interesting conversations with advertisers and PR agencies around having new ways to measure and take these actions. I'm not even going to try. There's someone in Kathy Kramer. She's amazing. She is thinking about surfacing voices and nuance in a way you'll never find basically on Twitter or other social media. She's going to be spending her sabbatical with us, designing basically technologies to scale her method of human-human, what we call deep situated listening. And we think that could be the recipe for creating a new kind of locally anchored communication networks. And so that's sort of actually increasingly becoming the other dimension of our lab. There's the analytics and indexing, and there's creating new kinds of networks. And yes, and this is my last slide, which is how it all comes together. If we can map and track, and meanwhile surface bridging voices and stories, whether it comes from Frontline or from sort of field listening, to bridge communities. And if you are succeeding, then you will be able to change metrics if you have the right metrics in place. with that, I apologize. I've gone over, but I did have a lot of content. So thank you.
We have about 12 minutes for Q&A.
Yes.
I wanted to ask a question about the metric used to measure emotion. So discussed did a lot of work for your argument in the initial piece.
And surprise. Mm-hmm.
And surprise. Could you, I'm interested more in discuss, could you expand on how you measured it? And then also, is there a way to tell, there's a big difference between being disgusted at like sour milk and being disgusted at another person in you. So can you tell when disgust is interpersonal?
It was very rudimentary. There's a dictionary from the Canadian Research Council that has a hardwired set of words that are associated with one of 8 emotions. And if you find that emotion, if we found that emotion, that one of those terms from that dictionary in the tweet, in the reply tweet, it would get tagged as that emotion. So any of the nuance that you have in mind, probably, and there's a lot of nuance that we didn't capture. And there's, I'm sure, errors, which is why I said that it's kind of a crude measure, but in aggregate, if there's a pattern, we thought it would be interesting to surface. So there's much more sophisticated ways to do emotion analysis. In fact, there's another group at the Media Lab that developed and has open source something called Deepmoji. Given a piece of text, it predicts what emojis a human being would express to capture the, and they have, I think, like 64 different emojis, so a much more fine-grained set of emotions. And it was trained by, several billion tweets that had emojis in them, so there's kind of a natural corpus. So we're starting experiments now with their coding system as an alternative. So if you're interested in that, that's something I think is available publicly as well.
So as you were showing those the last 2 stages, I found myself wondering if you have any sort of normative concerns about the outsized influence of sort of a relatively small niche of elite influencers. Like, you walk us through an anecdote. I'm sure she's a wonderful person.
Yep.
Why is she the arbiter of what healthy discourse is?
Yeah.
Do you have any concerns about this?
Yeah.
'Cause it's sort of, we're going away from public goods provision by sort of democratic means to by outside,
Yep.
wealthy, teched up influencers.
Yep. So I do have concerns. I'm also a pragmatist, so I think about how do you work with the world you've got, which is one in which influencers like Bridget, if you take, I don't know, top 1,000, top 5,000 influencers in the country, they are currently wielding huge influence on our public sphere. And the way, if they are keeping score, if they're seeing if they are, moving in the right direction, et cetera, there's an entire, as I said, machine built around optimizing for one thing, which is monetization. Okay, so I am concerned, and what I'm really concerned about is what's the basis on which influencers already today are choosing what to do. And the answer is, I'm not saying it's solely this, but the primary driver is this kind of, as Bridget will say, what's the best way to build up more fans? Selfies, certain kinds of selfies, an occasional provocation, and you build up your fans. But don't be too provocative. Don't start too many conversations, or you'll get ratioed. What does that mean? An advertiser will look at how many likes versus how many replies. If your ratio of replies to likes is too high, you must be controversial. So people ask Bridget, aren't you worried you're going to get ratioed? She's like, number one, I'm not doing this for advertising. Number two, if you look beyond the ratio at what kind of conversations people are having, I consider them to be healthy. So I'm not saying her normative judgments should shape the land, but
Aren't you?
what's that? No, I'm not.
Well, they are being exponentially amplified, so they therefore will help shape the land.
So what I'm doing is having conversations like this with quarter-baked or half-baked We have a set of principles. We're engaging people in seminars to say, is depolarization the problem or is it defragmentation? And algorithmically and empirically, what might be measures that are proxies for whether you're moving in a way or towards a more fragmented or polarized environment. And then how do you translate those metrics into tools for people who want to actually move in one direction versus another? They don't exist today. So the celebrities are having impact, outsized impact on the public sphere. And yet when you look at, well, what are the effective norms when it comes to our sort of civic dynamics? They're a byproduct that no one's even thinking about as they optimize for fan base and advertising. That should be more concerning than saying, hey, let's think about alternative metrics. Let's think about ways to complement that system, right? And it's not going to be Bridget determine. It's not going to be me. It's not going to be our lab, right? But we want to catalyze this thinking and say, hey, there are other things you can measure for. And the reason I mentioned the advertiser stories is there's a growing power source that we could tap into that will actually change advertiser behavior. Brands don't like being surprised by sudden boycotts to pull out or make a sudden decision, because it's suddenly you're in public saying, I'm going to pull out because I think this influencer is bad news. And that influencer, guess what? They're going to turn around and they're going to attack the advertiser, and you get all this ugliness spill out. But underneath it all is, what were they all optimizing for? Just one thing. So if advertisers start to say, no, we actually will not just build our brand wherever there's an engaged audience, then certain ways to build an engaged audience will turn out to be bad ones. Because I think one of the lessons I certainly have learned over the last couple of years is polarization, it turns out to be a great business model if you're a media company, right? Divide and enrage. An enraged audience is an engaged audience. And what are you selling? You're selling an engaged audience. So let me keep enraging, right? That's what's happened. And we think, oh, well, in the good old days, if it was we just had the broadcast networks again. Ironically, of all the people to give voice to this idea that polarization is a great business model, it was Les Moonves, CEO of our largest broadcast television network, CBS. In spring of 2016, he was asked in a public interview, what do you think about the rise of Donald Trump? And he said, well, I think it's bad for a country, but it's great for business, right? So business is better than ever for the media companies because you can sell division and anger. As long as advertisers keep happily just buying eyeballs, that doesn't shift. So if some advertisers want to change behavior, where are the metrics, where are the tools, where's the playbook? They don't exist. Yeah, I guess we have a couple of minutes. Yes, please.
I wonder if you could comment on what you see as the optimal meso level at which to look. So you can imagine just past the individual, you would have small group discussions at which you would have like billions of, not billions, but like many of them across the country, and then you could scale up and just have, like just before the full platform level, you would have a small number of large groups.
Yeah, it's a great question. I honestly don't know. This is an area of such important experimentation, because how you segment could completely change whether something looks good or bad. And so actually one question that actually the CTO of Twitter asked me is there some family of segmentations under which even if you resegment, the metrics stay somehow constant, or your kind of direction for what's good stays constant? Is there some kind of robustness in multiple segmentation? So I'm hoping people like David are going to figure this out for us. But it's a great question. Yeah, we don't know what the right scale is. It's interesting that because publishers can have meso level impact, where meso may even mean millions when you have like whether it's Frontline or Bridget touching millions, that there are kind of causal or sort of experiments you can run with single actors that have large scale impact. So that's a large scale. Maybe one last question. I don't know. I can keep going, but I think we're going to run out of time.
Just do one more.
Okay.
Yeah, very quick. You work inside one of these platforms, so I'm curious, do you really think that they are going to enact changes in the way they have designed the platforms? And if so in which way? Which tiny things can they change?
Yeah.
I'm
I-
thinking about Facebook mostly, but
Right. Well, I can comment more directly on Twitter. I think there's a reason their sitting CEO tweeted not one tweet, but a 12 or 13 tweet ode to public health of this health of the public sphere. I think they are prepared to make changes. I think Facebook is also prepared to make changes. I think Google is also. And quite frankly, there is a kind of existential threat on the table, right? The founders are coming to DC. This is unusual, right? And so there's been a
And
public...
not voluntarily.
Not voluntarily, and there is a bit of a public awakening of what many people who know how the industry works. But there's been a public awakening. Cambridge Analytica has started a conversation. A lot of people who work in the field are like, wait a minute, what's new here? Which thing triggered this? And I think the answer is not any one thing. It's just a system that, as enough people have realized what this actually means, and it takes, like many things, it's hard to sell someone insurance for a kind of extreme event until you experience an extreme event, and then you move in and you fix some stuff and get right. So I think we're in that mode a little bit now. So. Okay, thank you.